Hey y'all, just a quick little editor's note. There's a lot of flashing images and things that would be problematic for people with photosensitivity, so if that's you, maybe just treat this one as a podcast.
On August 30th, 2021, the US completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan. Within days, the Taliban, who the US had kept out of power for nearly 20 years, had once again taken control of the country. In light of seeing all the gruesome images coming out of Kabul and reports of human rights abuses, many began to wonder if leaving was the right idea or how the plans to withdraw had failed so spectacularly. Relatively few thought to investigate how the last 40 years of foreign policy blunders had led Afghanistan to this point. Very few, except for me, of course. Not to say I did it for the right reasons, it was actually extremely petty. In the course of researching our first video, which covered the many lies in Marcus Luttrell's account of Lone Survivor, I began investigating why the US had failed to establish a lasting peace in Afghanistan. But in the process, I realized that so much of what I read called back to the Soviet-Afghan War. Books on the topic started calling out to me like the Green Goblin mask. I couldn't help myself.
Betrayal must not be countenanced.
Early on in my research, I came across a book called Charlie Wilson's War, the extraordinary story of the largest covert operation in history. This book is thick as hell with tiny text, and it covers Texas Congressman Charlie Wilson, who worked to secure massive funds for the Mujahideen's rebel forces fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. It was adapted into a movie in 2007, produced by Tom Hanks, who starred alongside Julia Roberts and Philip Seymour Hoffman, God rest his beautiful soul. The movie would go on to secure multiple Oscar nominations and is really one of the only popular Western movies about the war outside of Rambo, which is too bad, because it sucks. Everyone in it is great, and it moves along well enough, but God, it just fucking sucks. What could have been a devastating story about one of the most poorly planned covert operations of all time is ultimately sanded down to become the story of how a charming, functional alcoholic teamed up with his sexy friends to spearhead a well-intentioned war effort that we can all kinda sorta feel good about until the end. And before I get into it, I want to put a giant disclaimer at the start of this video. I understand that because of the contents of our first video, a lot of our subscribers are current or former military men who are not particularly inclined towards communism or the Soviet Union. So I want to get ahead of things here. Before you get mad and start calling me a commie in the comments or whatever, I want to be clear about what this video is. What I'm doing here is filling in the gaps that this movie left us with when trying to understand how the US responded to the Soviet-Afghan War. You won't hear me talk much about the Soviets until the end because pretty much everyone agrees that they never should have went into Afghanistan and that once they did, they carried out one of the worst mass killings of the 20th century. We're all on the same page there. What people don't understand is how the US response ties together the fate of Afghanistan, 9/11, and the opioid crisis. With that said, I'm going to tell you the true story of Charlie Wilson's war. I'm going to tell you how the CIA helped to kill Afghanistan and how Tom Hanks helped them bury the body. Now, before I can get into the meat of the issues here, I first need to summarize what the movie is about and what it tells us about history. But really, if you haven't seen the movie, I think you're better off just watching it. It's fun. Tom Hanks and Julia Roberts are charming. Philip Seymour Hoffman is great. It's a good watch. But the short version is that the movie follows Charlie Wilson, a Texas Democrat who loves booze, cocaine, and also happens to be a member of Congress. While hanging out in a hot tub with a bunch of naked babes, he becomes interested in a newscast covering the Mujahideen's efforts to fight off the occupying forces of the Red Army. The newscast, which is actually far more interesting than the women trying to have sex with him, says that if Afghanistan falls, so too will the United States, which is pretty obviously not a true statement, but it seems to have an impact on Charlie. We then see him back at work where he's surrounded by beautiful women who he hired on completely meritocratic grounds. This is where he grabbed the bit of one of them saying, "Charlie always says you can't teach him to grow tits."
He says you can teach him to type, but you can't teach him to grow tits.
Based on Dan Rather's report and some news from Kabul, Charlie immediately doubles the covert ops budget in Afghanistan from $5 million to $10 million, thinking that he has completely changed the game. He then almost fucks Emily Blunt until his old friend Joanne Herring, the sixth wealthiest woman in Texas, calls him up to say that his $10 million for covert operations ain't shit. She convinces him to come see the screening of her movie covering the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, where he can mingle with wealthy donors. We are then introduced to our man at the CIA, Gust Avrakotos, who goes off on some snot-nosed suit named Henry Cravely for not giving him a promotion that he had earned. He very quickly establishes his credentials as the wacky, working-class loose cannon when he tells his superior to go f*** himself and smashes his office with a hammer. After blowing up Cravely, Gust is offered a role on the Afghan team where they are killing Russians in Afghanistan. We come back to Charlie Wilson, who is schmoozing with Joanne Herring at the movie screening she put on in her mansion. We get some brief allusions to Joanne's politics in this scene.
This is an ultra-right-wing group of anti-communist fanatics.
She's a liberal.
I'm a liberal.
Not where it counts.
It sounds bad to me, but I promise it will be much worse later. Joanne tells Charlie that he essentially oversees an unlimited budget, so doubling $5 million to $10 is really nothing. He should instead be going above and beyond like the US government did in El Salvador.
A real war, a state would issue a white paper outlining the communist threat the way they did in El Salvador.
And Nicaragua.
National Bipartisan Commission on Afghanistan, headed by Henry Kissinger the way they did in Central America.
Which are interesting examples to bring up. I would love to talk about why these are bad, but this video is really, really long, so I'll just say that everyone involved in these operations should be boiled. Anyway, Joanne convinces Charlie to meet up with her close personal friend and military dictator of Pakistan, President Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq, by questioning his manhood, of course. Oh, and this is after they fucked, and she came twice, by the way. That's an important little Easter egg you won't find in any of the history books. After we get a quick taste of the Soviets mowing down civilians from a helicopter, Charlie gets grilled by Zia and his advisors for failing to provide the Afghans with sufficient funds to fight off the Soviets. After this, Zia sends Charlie to a refugee camp in Pakistan full of maimed Afghans. Charlie is particularly moved by the children who have lost their limbs playing with mines disguised as toys by the Russians. They claim that these mines are designed to seriously injure the kids but not kill them so as to keep their parents at home and away from the battlefield. This lights a fire in Charlie, so he immediately lays into some stuffed suit station chief at the CIA named Harold Holt. This windbag doesn't want to raise the Afghan budget too much to avoid drawing attention, which Charlie thinks is just the gayest shit he's ever heard, and he storms off. Charlie requests another CIA representative in his office to emasculate, but instead of some nobody in a fancy suit, he gets our second-generation immigrant working-class hero, Gust Avrakotos. Unlike those other desk jockeys, Gust is a straight shooter, so he tells Charlie that $10 million is an insufficient budget to give the Mujahideen any hope of winning. He tells Charlie that the reason Holt and the bureaucracy at large are not interested in this money is that they don't care about the Mujahideen winning. What they care about is bleeding the Russians and giving them their own Vietnam. But Gust and his team of 3 other guys are doing things differently and actually want to win this thing. Charlie then meets Mike Vickers, the team's weapons guru, who, of course, is playing 4 guys at chess all at once. You can never just be good at your job in these kinds of movies, you always need to be autistic too. This guy just drops every weapon needed to win the war off the top of his head, and Charlie is sold. We then get a delicious bit of irony when Charlie tells Joanne to tone down her talk of religion when promoting the war because the US doesn't fund religious wars. And I have to agree with him on this one. Keep religion out of my schools, keep it out of my sports, and keep it the out of my jihad in the Middle East. We get a quick glimpse of what our CIA team is up to when Vickers hatches his plan to switch up CIA funds from going to a wide range of Mujahideen groups to a more narrow, elite group of fighters. They specifically recommended putting funds toward Ahmad Shah Massoud in the Panjshir Valley. This is notable because I swear to God, this is the only Afghan they name drop in the entire movie. About the war in Afghanistan. Charlie then gets the head of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, Doc Long, on board with his Afghan project by showing him the same refugee camp that moved him earlier in the movie. Interestingly, much of Doc Long's speech to the Afghans centers on the Soviet involvement in the Vietnam War. The rest focuses on God, of course. He tells the Afghans that this is a fight of good versus evil, and the side with God will always win. We flash forward a few years down the line, and the Mujahideen are still struggling to match the Soviets' air capabilities. Charlie ups the budget to $70 million and seeks to go further to $100 million. They're ultimately able to introduce Stinger missiles to the conflict, which allows a couple of unarmed, for now, Afghans to shoot down a couple of Soviet Hinds. We then get a montage of helicopters being shot down, as well as some stats on how many went down and when. This escalation is so effective that Charlie successfully ups the covert operation budget from $250 million to $500 million, which is matched by the Saudis, making it the largest covert operation in history. It ultimately pays off with the Soviets signing the Geneva Accords on April 14, 1988, making Afghanistan the first country to defeat the Soviet Union in combat. The movie ends with Charlie and the lads at Langley celebrating their victory before Gust brings things back down to earth by informing Charlie that the crazies are rolling into Kandahar. He encourages Wilson to now shift his efforts to getting humanitarian aid to the Afghans to rebuild the country. In spite of Charlie's best efforts to drum up this aid, his pleas fall on deaf ears as the concern for the Afghans turned out to only extend as far as the Soviet occupation. His peers relay a quote to him from the president saying,
He said Afghanistan. Is that still going on?
Which is a real quote that they don't attribute to any particular president, but it's worth noting that they neglect to give the proper context to it. I'll get back to that later too. Before the final credits roll, the movie makes some vague allusions to how this failure to support the Afghan people after the war wrapped up had a role in the subsequent attacks on 9/11. But if you're not looking for it, you're probably going to miss it altogether. Now, before I get into the parts of this video where I get mad, I want to be clear up front. The purpose of this is not to debunk this movie for telling verifiable lies. This isn't Lone Survivor. To the extent that there are misrepresentations in this movie, they largely exist to keep the plot flowing smoothly and make it easier for the audience to follow, which is totally fine. I'll dig into certain errors here and there, but the problem with this movie is not as much the lies it may tell, the problem is all the ugly truths it knowingly withholds from its audience. By looking at the real history of this conflict, we can learn a lot about Afghanistan, the CIA, 9/11, and the heroin trade. But before we get there, let's dig a little deeper into our protagonists. Alright, as far as we're told in the movie, the war effort is effectively being spearheaded on the American side by Joanne Herring, who is spreading the good word of the Mujahideen and recruits her friend and orgasm donator, Charlie Wilson, into the project. Charlie rallies support in Congress and expands the covert ops budget, which is then matched by the Saudis. That budget is then used by Gust Avrakotos to buy weapons, which are then funneled into the Pakistan intelligence service, the ISI, under President Zia, who passes those weapons to the Mujahideen. It seems like a pretty clean operation to fight the evil Red Army, but I want to dig a little deeper into each individual piece of this puzzle. There is some acknowledgement of who exactly Joanne is in this movie, but I think this is worth expanding on. As Charlie's assistant, Bonnie, points out, Joanne is a member of the ultra-right-wing group, the Minutewomen, which is a sister of the paramilitary force known as the Minutemen. Essentially, the Minutemen were a group of far-right anti-communist dipshits with ties to some of the country's most influential neo-Nazis, who organized in the early 1960s around the assumption that the Soviet Union was in the midst of planning an invasion of the United States after subverting it from the inside. The Minutewomen, on the other hand, were founded in 1949 and focused themselves on the classroom, ensuring that proper American values were being taught from kindergarten to college. Their ranks were largely made up of wealthy white women who hated socialized medicine, supported the oil industry, opposed racial integration, which they called racial mongrelization, and above all, just loved America. They ran letter-writing campaigns, tried to get teachers fired, harassed school board officials. They were basically the same as the anti-CRT crowd from the past few years. If you've seen that, you've seen their whole shtick. The group would ultimately fade into a relative obscurity as Americans turned against McCarthyism. Now, it's impossible to say exactly when these ladies became irrelevant, but it would be at some point in the 50s or 60s. The fact that Joanne could still be identified as one in the early 80s is just wild. And I'm not trying to play some guilt by association crap. She would go on to say that she remained proud of her involvement with the group and that, quote, they opened my eyes to the conspiracy that threatened our way of life. In a similar vein to the Minutewomen, Joanne was also involved with the John Birch Society, a far-right anti-communist organization that essentially laid the groundwork for the kind of anti-Semitic conspiracism that has completely taken over the online right today. Again, Joanne does not disavow her time in the group. In a 2011 interview, she said,
"Well, you know what the Minutewomen did in the John Birch Society? They asked you to read. Just read what was going on. And if you felt like it was important and should be changed, some of the laws or what was going on in Washington or what you saw in world affairs, to write a letter. I don't really think that's very compromising."
While she conceded later in the interview that the group had moved perhaps a bit too far to the right, she appears to take more of an issue with their tactics rather than their rhetoric, which would include things like the founder of the John Birch Society calling Eisenhower a dedicated, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. Joanne would find her way into the Soviet-Afghan war through her friendship with former head of French intelligence Alexander de Moranche, who introduced her to the Pakistani ambassador to Washington, Sahibzada Yaqub Khan. Through this relationship, Herring would be appointed Pakistan's honorary consul in Houston. She threw herself into the role and fell in love with the country. When Pakistani President Bhutto was overthrown in a military coup and hanged by his successor, President Zia, the US turned their back on the country. Jimmy Carter rightly pointed out that Zia was a dictator attempting to build an atomic bomb and cut off all military and economic assistance to the country. But Herring didn't take part in the demonization of Zia. Her friend de Moranche convinced her that Zia was one of just 7 men standing in the way of the global communist conspiracy. So she met with Zia personally and decided that this guy was just fucking awesome. This was the first instance of de Moranche quietly changing the course of history, but as we'll see, it would be far from the last. So this is where the story begins. One of the wealthiest women in Texas, filled to the brim with nonsensical anti-communist conspiracies, was introduced to an Islamic fundamentalist military dictator by a legend of French intelligence. The history of the world was about to be irreparably changed by a woman who was born too late to support the Nazis and too early to watch Alex Jones. God have mercy on our souls. Our next link in the chain is Charlie Wilson. It should go without saying that Charlie is a raging misogynist and womanizer, and the film does allude to his alcoholism. But it neglects to tell the audience that the night before his scheduled flight to Pakistan with Doc Long, Charlie was in a drunken hit-and-run accident. He claims to have made sure the kid was okay before driving back to his place to hide while the police came looking for him, but due to his connection with local PD, he was able to make his flight without an issue and face a minor charge when he came back. More relevant for the purposes of this video is that Charlie was a virulent anti-communist. As George Crile's book covers, Charlie was extremely cozy with the corrupt and murderous Somoza regime in Nicaragua and supported his continued rule over the imperfect but much more humane leftist Sandinistas, even when he had largely fallen out of favor with the general population. He would go as far as to defeat Jimmy Carter's efforts to cut off all aid to Somoza, despite his party generally supporting the effort. Charlie was more conflicted over Vietnam, but not because he recognized it was a regional conflict he had no business taking part in. Instead, Charlie withheld his support for the South Vietnamese simply because they didn't seem like a viable opponent against the communists of the North. But Crile makes a point of telling the reader that Charlie felt that his votes on the issue were like a betrayal to him. The last thing I want to add to his profile is that Charlie Wilson always wanted to take part in a historic fight. He was too young to fight in World War II, still in the Naval Academy during the Korean War, and unable to commit himself to the war in Vietnam for logistical and political reasons. When he sunk his teeth into Afghanistan, he felt that this was finally his time to make a difference. And what better time than the war that he repeatedly claimed was the one morally unambiguous crusade of our time. Beyond that, there's really not a whole lot else to say about Charlie Wilson. He's more or less exactly what the movie makes him out to be, a fairly effective politician and a charming but kind of naive anti-communist. Alright, now, in my book, this guy gets tossed in the can just because he's a CIA officer, but I understand that not everyone is so inclined, so I'll elaborate on why Gust, specifically, sucks ass. Now, the movie goes out of its way to not sully the good name of any of its characters, major or otherwise. This Henry Cravely character that Gust screams at is not real. The guy he actually told to f himself was named William Graver. In a similar vein, the loser that Charlie Wilson dresses down in Pakistan is not named Harold Holt, but rather Howard Hart. Given that the movie doesn't seem to want to frame any actual CIA agents in a negative light, it's interesting to note that they left in this bit where Gus talks about the work he did in Greece for the agency.
I was posted in Greece for 15. Papandreou wins that election if I don't help the junta take him prisoner.
This isn't a video about Greece, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to give you a short version so you get an idea of who Gust is. After World War II, the Greek communists became very popular because of their armed resistance to the Nazis, much like they did in Italy, Yugoslavia, and other European countries. This was met with a large degree of repression from the government, leading to civil war. The US backed the right-wing government crawling with fascist and Nazi collaborators, which CBS chief European correspondent Howard K. Smith said was so bad it was nearly unparalleled. Meanwhile, the left was supported by the worldwide communist conspiracy. You may know them as the three most powerful communist regimes to ever exist. That's right, baby, Bulgaria, Albania, and Yugoslavia. The USSR had opted to sit this one out, in part because Stalin didn't think the West would ever let Greece go communist, and partly because he had promised Churchill to stay out of his sphere of influence. The result was that the left was defeated, and according to future Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou, the US held dictatorial power over the Greek economy. The CIA would also assist the dictatorship in setting up the KYP, a secret police service which would be used to torture local dissidents. By 1964, things had changed drastically, with the relatively progressive George Papandreou, Andreas' father, winning a majority government. It's worth noting that although this guy was a staunch anti-communist who was installed by the British briefly in 1944, he was far from the puppet prime minister the West was looking for, as he was willing to collaborate with the Soviets. He was then removed by the king in July of 1965 after the CIA station chief in Athens helped to buy off members of Papandreou's own party. By 1967, the government seemed as though they could no longer delay the next election, which George Papandreou was favored to win again. So naturally, in April of that year, a military coup was carried out, instituting martial law, censorship, torture, and murder to stop what they perceived to be a communist takeover. As any reasonable anti-communist government would do, they immediately set out to crack down on dudes with long hair and girls in miniskirts and made church attendance mandatory for the youth. George Papandreou was then arrested by the military junta led by former Nazi security battalion captain George Papadopoulos and died under house arrest. At this stage, it's hard to overstate how much the CIA's seedy, disgusting tentacles had wrapped their way around the Greek government. The KYP's officers were trained in the US by the CIA. Andreas Papandreou found that KYP regularly bugged the conversations of him and his peers and passed the info they gleaned over to the CIA. He then fired 2 of the top men of the KYP, replacing them with men that he trusted, who also turned out to be CIA. Of the 5 officers who staged the military coup in 1967, 4 of them had close ties to the US military or CIA in Greece. US representatives allegedly referred to Papadopoulos as the first CIA agent to become premier of a European country. By the time he took charge, he had been on the payroll for 15 years. He used his time in power to spread propaganda about how communism was the greatest threat to Greece and that the time under Nazi occupation was actually not that bad. Now this is where Gust Avrakotos comes into play. He had recently joined the agency and had been posted to Greece a few years prior, so he was great friends with the dictatorship's upper crust. When the US Embassy asked that Gust tell the junta to release George Papandreou from captivity, he did as they requested, saying,
"That's the official position. You should let him go. But unofficially, as your friend, my advice is to shoot the motherfucker because he's going to come back to haunt you."
As George Crile would put it in the book, quote, "He was for all practical purposes an invisible member of the ruling junta. When Gust's identity as a CIA agent was exposed by a leftist magazine in Greece, he was quickly labeled the Butcher of Cyprus and the fascist CIA overlord of the colonels." The book is not entirely clear on who Gust did and did not kill in Greece, but I think it's fair to assume that his cozy relationship to a junta that was called out repeatedly for its routine use of torture makes these kinds of nicknames fair game. For his part, Gust would joke that he actually ran the country entirely. Perhaps the most important thing to say about Gust is that he is a piece of shit for doing this gig. The second most important thing to say is that he's not stupid. People like him are exactly why it can be extremely difficult to talk about the CIA and what they got up to in the Cold War without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. George Crile provides at least 3 instances of Gust's discretion when it comes to covering up his unethical or straight up illegal activities at the agency. The first occurs when Gust needs to do some killing in Afghanistan that went beyond the scope of what was permitted by US law. He simply handed the funds over to the British MI6, who weren't bound by the same restrictions under a prime minister to the right of Attila the Hun. He explicitly told the Brits that should they use his funds for any lethal operations, they should not tell him about it. The second instance involved Gust's relationship with Charlie Wilson. In Charlie's unrelenting quest to shoot the Soviets out of the sky, he had set his heart on the Swiss Oerlikon, a weapon that was fancy but far too cumbersome to be much good to the Mujahideen. Despite its lack of effectiveness, Gust wanted to purchase them anyway to keep Wilson on the hook and keep the gravy train rolling. When one of his subordinates made it clear that he wanted to be honest to Congress about the fact that the weapon was not helpful to the war effort, Gust pressured him out of testifying and sent him home sick for the day. The third instance involved providing training to the Mujahideen when they planned to scale back the number of fighters receiving US funds. He told his team to
"Teach the Mujahideen how to kill. Pipe bombs, car bombs, but don't ever tell me how you've done it in writing. Just do it."
As Crile points out in a footnote, this made Gust significantly craftier than your average intelligence agent, as the CIA's Central American station was in hot water at the same time for handing out assassination manuals all over the place. And hey, if you're into unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats deliberately skirting the thin amount of regulation they are subjected to so they can kill more people in the fight against communism, this guy rules. But if you're someone who likes democratic governance and doesn't love the idea of a virtually unknown fascist collaborator dancing around the rules, then this guy is absolutely a demon. So to summarize, on the American side, we have a war effort spearheaded by a far-right oil baroness coaxing a naive war hawk politician into funneling billions of dollars into a guerrilla force by way of a fascist-adjacent cretin. We're off to a good start. Let's hope the guys they're giving the money to end up being trustworthy. Okay, so to start off, you'll hear a lot of people say that the US created Al-Qaeda, or created the Taliban, or funded Osama bin Laden as part of the war effort. More recently, I've seen some of the weird NAFO freaks with the smush dog profile pictures on Twitter claim the opposite, that the US funded the Mujahideen, a resistance group that would go on to become the Northern Alliance, the main opposition to the Taliban. As it always tends to be with history, both sides are touching on something true, but oversimplifying to the point of being kinda wrong. The reason this is so confusing to so many people is that the Mujahideen were never really one cohesive unit. Pretty much everyone in the over 70 groups fighting the Soviets could be considered Mujahideen. The bulk of what is written about the war will only really mention 7 of these groups as having any sort of influence though. The reason for this is that the CIA ran the vast majority of their aid through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, which essentially picked 7 groups to provide the bulk of their funding to. If you wanted to get any meaningful outside support, you had to fall in line behind one of these factions. Of these 7 groups, hell, of all the people in Afghanistan, only one is mentioned by name in the movie, so let's start there. Ahmad Shah Massoud is name dropped as the CIA's primary target for funding in Afghanistan. We're told that he is the guy that Gust and the military whiz kid Mike Vickers have identified as their best chance for success in the region. And a cursory look at Massoud leads one to believe they might have made the right call here. He was one of the most competent military strategists in Afghanistan and an avid reader, studying the works of Mao Zedong, Che Guevara, and other guerrilla leaders to better understand how to lead an effective resistance. He was also the only Mujahideen leader who made serious attempts to set up an effective government apparatus and set the stage for some kind of centralized state once the war was over. These days, Massoud is generally viewed fondly as one of the greatest guerrilla leaders of the modern age and a serious missed opportunity for the people of Afghanistan. There's some truth to this, as a more moderate Muslim leader with military credibility and a willingness to share power would certainly be preferable to the Taliban leadership that Afghanistan would end up with. But this lionization of Massoud overlooks his very real flaws that we need to contend with. I think it's worth starting with the fact that although Massoud was certainly more moderate than many of his peers who would go on to provide material support to al-Qaeda and was openly critical of the organization, he was still fairly radical in his own right. After Mohammad Daoud Khan, the Prime Minister of Afghanistan and cousin to King Zahir Shah, seized power through a bloodless coup in 1973 to become president, Pakistan enlisted Massoud to carry out a revolution against him, fearing that the new government would be taken over by communist influence. After Massoud stirred up some trouble in the Panjshir Valley, his forces were crushed without much issue, and he was forced to flee back to Pakistan until 1978. Deep into the war with the Soviets, Massoud held firm in his anti-communism as well as his belief in an Islamic theocracy. He believed that communism and capitalism were corrupt and that Islam should be the basis for government in Afghanistan. Massoud also believed in the concept of takfir, meaning that true believers could point out Muslim imposters, a radical departure from the more orthodox line in Islam, which states that no Muslim can deny the belief of any other so long as they accept Allah as God and Muhammad as his prophet. Massoud's politics were radical enough that as the war came to an end, Osama bin Laden's mentor, Abdullah Azzam, actually endorsed him as Afghanistan's next leader, saying, "I have seen the true Islamic leader. It is Massoud." Now to be clear, Massoud would go on to fight against al-Qaeda and was ultimately killed by them, so I don't want to paint them as being friendly. They were not. But I also wouldn't want anyone to get the impression that this guy was a liberal either. Beyond the issues with his ideology, Massoud's men had serious disciplinary issues in spite of their military success. In George Crile's book, Gust Avrakotos tells the story of British MI6 intelligence agents spending some time with Massoud's men, only to witness one of his lieutenants oversee the gang of a Soviet prisoner. Naturally, the agents said that Afghan culture was different from the West, and that raping an infidel wasn't as much of an atrocity for them as it would be for us. With that, they concluded that these were men of honor who could be trusted with their funds. This issue of troop discipline was not an isolated incident, though. After the Soviet withdrawal and the collapse of the Soviet-backed government, Massoud joined the new regime as defense minister. While fighting off their enemies in the subsequent civil war, his forces trafficked heroin in the north and committed atrocities in Kabul. These issues more or less sank any hope of Massoud holding power in Afghanistan ever again. After being defeated by the Taliban and fleeing Kabul, he would spend the rest of his days trying to put together a force that could take on the Taliban before being killed by al-Qaeda in a suicide bombing just days before 9/11. After his death, the US would collaborate with his Northern Alliance allies to topple the Taliban, but the discipline issue would persist in his absence as the alliance would turn the country into a hub of heroin traffic and warlordism for years to come. But we can dig into that heroin problem a little bit more later. All this to say that Massoud was a deeply problematic dude, but even with these flaws, his ability to effectively command an army and potentially set up some kind of functioning government apparatus made him one of the better options to invest in as far as Mujahideen leaders go. So if that's the case, if I believe that, what's the problem, right? Why is this video still so long, and why am I still so angry? The problem is that when the movie tells us that Massoud was the primary client of the CIA in Afghanistan, they are lying. Massoud did not receive the most CIA money during the war. In fact, it was not even remotely close. Some authors have gone as far as to say that Massoud received almost nothing from the CIA, and much of what he did get was stolen by the ISI, who favored the more fundamentalist Mujahideen leaders. To the extent that the CIA provided for Massoud, they didn't really get going until 1984, when they started giving him money and light supplies without informing Pakistan. Now, I don't have an exact dollar figure of how much aid Massoud did receive, but to put things into perspective, the CIA provided between 2,000 and 2,500 Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen in the latter half of the war. As Charlie Wilson tells it, these things were the crucial tool that turned the tide and forced the Soviets to pull out of the country. But Massoud received just 8 missiles. 8. That is, at most, less than 0.5% of the total. And they weren't provided until the end of the war, so he never had a chance to use them, meaning that he effectively received none. So if that's the case, surely the CIA must have found someone even less problematic and even more well-suited to potentially run the country and maintain friendly relations with after the war ended. Right? Right? Wrong, motherfucker. The CIA's favorite Afghan was actually one of the meanest, black-eyed motherfuckers walking the earth, Mr. Blowback himself, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He was said to have gathered around him the most radical, anti-Western, transnational Islamists fighting in the jihad, including bin Laden and other Arabs who arrived as volunteers. Although Hekmatyar's brutality was well known, with stories of him terrifying Soviet troops by severing their arms and legs and leaving them barely alive to be found by their peers, he was equally incompetent and corrupt. And for that, the CIA gave him over half of the $2 billion that they covertly supplied to the Mujahideen. That is over $1 billion going to Hekmatyar, the most that any CIA client had ever received before and possibly since. But this was not a guy who let the money change him after an honest upbringing. His personal history was sketchy from the very beginning, such that any intelligence agency worth its salt should have known not to touch this guy. He got his start in the radical politics of Kabul University, where he was appointed to be the political director of the Muslim Youth Organization in 1973. The group appeared to be unbothered by the fact that Hekmatyar was in jail at the time for ordering his followers to kill a Maoist student. It was around the same time that Hekmatyar began building a reputation as the man, quote, responsible for the practice of throwing acid in the faces of Afghan women who failed to cover themselves properly. I cannot stress enough that this is the most consistent fact you will ever find about Afghanistan. Every book I read said something along the lines of, and there was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the guy who throws acid in women's faces. In addition to his far-right, arguably fascist politics, Hekmatyar was also a heroin trafficker who would use his connections with the CIA and the ISI to become one of the most successful in the region. The implications of which I'll discuss a little later. Along with Massoud, Hekmatyar would collaborate with the ISI to attempt to overthrow President Dawood in favor of an Islamic government. Despite their efforts flaming out rather quickly, the ISI fell in love with Hekmatyar and made sure that he was poised to receive all that he needed from the CIA when the Soviets invaded a few years later. There are 3 primary reasons for this.
Number one!
The first is that the ISI and President Zia had ideological sympathies with Hekmatyar and his radical allies. The second is that many Pashtuns, the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan, sought to create an ethnically unified nation called Pashtunistan, which would seek to incorporate a considerable amount of the Pakistani population. This didn't fly with the Pakistani government, so they wanted to ensure that the material support they provided would not go to Pashtuns who may force the issue. And although Hekmatyar was ethnically Pashtun, he had been isolated from the traditional tribal structure, and he had accepted the British-drawn Durand Line, which marked the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, meaning that he was not a threat to Pakistan in this regard. The third is that of all the Mujahideen leaders, Hekmatyar originally commanded the smallest following inside of Afghanistan, and was not well liked by the other Mujahideen leaders. Reporter Robert Kaplan claimed that in his experience, Hekmatyar was loathed by all the other party leaders, fundamentalists and moderate alike. To my untrained eye, this would be a good reason to send funds to someone else, but from Pakistan's perspective, this was a guy they could build from the ground up. Because of his lack of indigenous support, he would be almost entirely dependent on the ISI for continued success. And because of his ruthlessness, distaste for dissent, and propensity to murder his rivals, it was very hard to leave Hekmatyar's party once you were in, giving Pakistan a solid chance at building up a friendly leader next door. It actually almost worked too, as Hekmatyar would go on to command the largest guerrilla force in Afghanistan, despite many Afghans finding him to be an unpalatable prick of a guy. Now you may remember that Pakistan forced our boy Charlie to agree to run all CIA funds through the ISI, which could lead one to conclude that the US was blindly handcuffed to whoever they opted to support. And there is some degree of truth to this, as the ISI did allocate much of the funds and weapons that came from the US. The problem is that the CIA was not unaware of Hekmatyar. In fact, they very actively advocated for providing aid to him throughout the war. When speaking to a French intelligence agent, one CIA officer resisted pivoting funds to Massoud by saying,
Gulbuddin is not as bad as you fear, and Massoud is not as good as you hope.
And when Washington started raising questions about how much money was being given to Hekmatyar, a guy who was so radical he refused to shake hands with the infidel Ronald Reagan, the CIA adamantly...
Motherfucker, don't touch Reagan?
Yeah, it's bad. The CIA adamantly defended themselves, saying that his forces were simply the most efficient at killing Soviets and that the more secular, royalist Afghan groups were too corrupt and too ineffective to be worthy of such funds. The CIA's Islamabad station chief Milton Bearden insisted that although the ISI's allocation of CIA funds had effectively killed all leftist, nationalist, and secular elements in the Afghan resistance, this Hekmatyar guy sure was good at killing Soviets, and that was all that really mattered. Even when his forces were attacking Massoud's men so often that some began to wonder if he was a KGB agent, it didn't really move the needle, because from the CIA's perspective, even if there were legitimate concerns about Hekmatyar's impact on a long-term peace in Afghanistan, they didn't really think there was much they could do, or didn't really think it was their problem. And to be clear, the US foreign policy machine is not a monolith, so there was dissent on whether giving massive amounts of money to Hekmatyar was the correct course of action. Edmund McWilliams was a staunchly anti-communist conservative who was appointed to be a U.S. Special Envoy to Afghanistan in 1988 as the U.S. prepared for the Soviet withdrawal. The position was created as some Americans had raised concerns about whether someone like Hekmatyar leading a post-war Afghanistan would be in their best interests. So McWilliams was tasked with meeting rebel leaders and providing recommendations on how the U.S. should approach things. But what he saw on the ground in Afghanistan horrified him. He said that everywhere he went, Afghans would tell him that Hekmatyar's fighters, with the full backing of Saudi intelligence, the ISI, and the Arab Afghans recruited for the jihad, were murdering anyone who stood in his way of holding absolute power when the Soviets were gone. In addition to Hekmatyar killing Saeed Bahuddin Majrou, the academic whose polls showed that Afghans wanted the former king to lead the country, the ISI was also believed to have ordered the murder of Massoud's older brother, Deen Mohammed. The Pakistani intelligence service would continue to manipulate payouts such that rebel forces had to join Hekmatyar to qualify. But McWilliams was just discovering what the Afghans had warned Americans for years, with one telling them, "For God's sake, you're financing your own assassins." Based on everything he was hearing from the Afghans and other American diplomats, he sent out a cable to the State Department, CIA, National Security Council, and select members of Congress, warning them of the resentment that was building among the Afghans. The CIA's Milton Bearden's response to the cable was to call McWilliams that little shit. He claimed he was misinformed and that the CIA had actually been doing a lot to make sure guys like Massoud were getting their fair share from the ISI too. McWilliams believed that he was just doing his job by asking questions about how the US was getting involved, but his questions only served to piss off everyone around him. The result was that the US Embassy began to investigate McWilliams based on CIA reports indicating that he couldn't be trusted with classified materials. Naturally, the embassy's investigation also began to look into other questions about McWilliams' integrity, like whether he was an alcoholic, or worse yet, gay. Once the Soviets had withdrawn and the Afghan president Najibullah continued to maintain his power and stave off massive rebel attacks, the White House shifted their policy from one of getting the Soviets out to one of pushing for Afghan self-determination. Big air quotes. McWilliams believed that if this was genuinely the goal of US foreign policy, then it made no sense to continue supporting guys like Hekmatyar, who were just as much Pakistani puppets as someone like Najibullah had been a Soviet one. Not only did supporting him contradict their stated policy, he also believed, correctly, that a radical right-wing government in Kabul would not be in America's best interest. He believed that the US had made a mistake in not helping the Afghans to create a transitional government while negotiating a Soviet withdrawal, but that it wasn't too late to cut off the covert military aid and begin working on a political solution. And he wasn't alone. The evidence he laid out in his cables convinced State Department and British intelligence officials that the CIA needed to move away from Hekmatyar and instead focus on bringing exiled intellectuals and politicians back to collaborate with more politically competent Mujahideen leaders like Massoud to create a legitimately representative government in Kabul. The CIA, however, held firm that this was fucking stupid and chose to continue working with the ISI to fund Hekmatyar's resistance. Bearden would argue that politically independent Afghanistan made no sense since the border between them and Pakistan had just been drawn by, quote, a few white guys. Which is hilarious, considering Pakistan felt very strongly that the white guy line should stay exactly where it was, and liked Hekmatyar specifically because he would not fight them on where that line would go. The Pakistani government wanted an Afghanistan that they could control from a distance. Self-determination had nothing to do with it. Now, there is something to be said for the fact that McWilliams was not privy to all of what the CIA was doing. They did work around the ISI to get Masood aid and work on humanitarian projects that he did not have clearance to know about. But they also accepted on its face the claim that the resistance uniformly wanted to fight until the Soviet-backed government had been obliterated. For this reason, Bearden and the US ambassador to Pakistan, Robert Oakley, had McWilliams transferred back to Washington as soon as the opportunity presented itself. In his parting cable to Oakley, McWilliams stated,
I believed and continue to believe that we were wrong to have been so close to some in the alliance. Wrong to have given the ISI such power, and now wrong to not be actively seeking a political settlement. I am sorry I became for you part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Perhaps I was in error, but I don't think so.
History would prove McWilliams to be correct. But before I get there, I think it's fair to say that the things I've outlined thus far do not reflect well on the CIA and the US involvement at large. But this is not necessarily an indictment of Charlie Wilson and his peers directly. I mean, it's fair to assume that because Gust was running the Afghan desk, he was probably pretty familiar with Hekmatyar. But what about Charlie and Joanne? As you'll recall, the movie does not feature Gulbuddin Hekmatyar at all, which one may assume to mean that our protagonists simply weren't aware of what he was up to. Except, they totally were. In fact, the movie gets surprisingly close to Hekmatyar on two occasions. The first occurs near the beginning of the film when Charlie Wilson attends Joanne's movie screening. Despite not being shown on screen, the documentary heavily featured the brave freedom fighters of one Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. We learn this in George Crile's book when Charlie and Joanne are doing their rounds meeting with various Mujahideen leaders. While speaking with Professor Mujahideen, a more moderate resistance leader, Joanne begins to gush about how much she admired Hekmatyar. Mujahideen shot back that Hekmatyar was a monster who was killing rival Mujahideen and could not be supported by any, quote, self-respecting nation. Rather than heeding his word and recognizing her grave mistake, Joanne, of course, disagreed and insisted that Gulbuddin was actually cool and not a psychopath. History would prove him correct and make a fool of yet another psycho-libertarian. The second scene in the movie with Hekmatyar's fingerprints is towards the end of the film, when Wilson finally secures Stinger missiles for his boys in Afghanistan. We're treated to an uplifting scene involving a small group of Mujahideen shooting down 3 Russian Hinds. As George Crile tells us, the man doing the shooting was named Ghaffar, a radical Islamic fundamentalist who reported to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. This is pretty significant when we remember that this movie told us that Masood was the CIA's favorite man, but he couldn't even secure a meager amount of Stinger missiles until he didn't need them anymore. Instead, these supposedly pivotal weapons ended up in the hands of the evilest motherfuckers in the country. Speaking of Stinger missiles, now would be the best time to talk about the impact of Charlie's favorite weapon. One of the major points of this movie and the book it's based on is the idea that the introduction of the Stinger won the war. That the Soviets were able to dominate the Afghans from the sky, and the weapons being provided to the Mujahideen were insufficient to take down Soviet aircraft. It was only after the bureaucracy grew a big hairy pair of balls and provided Stinger missiles that the Soviets actually started falling from the sky, and they marched out of the country with their asses in their hands. The movie even gives us a cool montage of all the damage they did. Hell yeah, baby, God bless America. Bald eagle screeching sounds. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I know. Aren't they just kind of like, ah? Like, don't put that sound in there. The Reds. I hope they. Wait, hold on. Let me take a step back here. It may be that the story which gives us our history directly from the mouth of a loudmouth Texan could be inaccurate. Let's do some analysis and figure out exactly how impactful these stingers actually were. So here, I want to define effectiveness in 3 ways. The first 2 could be seen as indirectly precipitating a Soviet withdrawal, and the last one is more direct. The first would be the narrow view that it increased the number of Soviet aircraft shot down throughout the remainder of the war. Soviet General Valentin Verenikov acknowledged in an interview after the Soviet withdrawal that although the Stinger did impact Soviet strategy, he disputed the figures touted by America and claimed that the Stinger did not drastically increase the destruction of Soviet aircraft. The charts he would ultimately provide indicated that the Soviets lost a grand total of 114 planes and 332 helicopters over the course of the war from 1979 to 1989. In 1986, the final war with minimal Stinger usage, the Soviets lost 17 planes and 44 helicopters. In 1987, when the Stinger was in full swing, these figures were 19 and 49. In 1988, just 16 and 14. For reference, the US is said to have lost over 5,000 helicopters in the Vietnam War. That's not to say that Stingers were ineffective weapons, but rather that the Soviets were able to effectively avoid the Stinger by using flares and flying higher to avoid detection, which would lead to less accuracy, more civilian casualties, more Mujahideen supplies entering the country, and larger scale combat operations on the part of the resistance. To the extent that more aircraft started coming down, the increase could be attributed to Afghan losses, as their aircraft were not suited for higher altitudes. But given that the Soviets continued to fund the Afghan government and provide weapons after they left, I think those losses are largely irrelevant to the claim that the Stinger brought about a withdrawal. The second way to define effectiveness of the Stinger would be to determine if it increased the amount of Soviet casualties. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Soviets were forced to change their tactics and rely less on air support, which provided the Mujahideen with strategic advantages in the field. It's plausible that engaging in a ground war with less reliable air support could bring about more Soviet deaths and precipitate a withdrawal. But again, the evidence just seems to fall short. Roderick Braithwaite writes that Soviet casualties peaked before Gorbachev took power in the USSR and began to fall around mid-1985, over a year before the Stinger was introduced. Now, it can be a bit difficult to pin down exactly how many Soviets died in the war, with some estimates going as high as 75,000. Braithwaite, however, writes that the official figure was just over 15,000, and that the Russian Defense Ministry produced a book of remembrance tracking the dead, which was ultimately accepted to be reliable. A year-by-year table I found on Johnson.net adds up to 14,060 Soviet deaths over the course of the war, which is close to Braithwaite's figure and even closer to Wikipedia's estimate of 14,453. This Johnson table backs up Braithwaite's assertion that Soviet casualties did not increase after the Stinger was introduced, with the highest numbers of deaths occurring in 1984, 82, and 85 in descending order. Again, we see that Afghan military deaths increased steadily over this period, but this would not appear to be a motivator in removing Soviet troops in the same way their own deaths would be. The third and most direct way to determine the effectiveness of the Stinger would be to see if there was any evidence that it brought about a faster withdrawal than would have otherwise been expected. Again, the evidence just isn't there. Declassified documents from the Soviet Union have provided no evidence of the Stingers influencing their withdrawal plans. When the Politburo met to set their timeline to withdraw, they made no mention of Stingers or US escalation playing a role in their decision-making. Journalist Selig Harrison's analysis of the situation indicated that the introduction of the Stinger did not drastically alter the Soviet position in Afghanistan, as both sides had fought to a stalemate by 1985. Although the Soviet tactics may have changed, they didn't lose any of their entrenched positions once the Stingers showed up. Their goal was to hold key areas in Afghanistan, and they were successful in doing so. In fact, the Russians with first-hand knowledge of the situation have indicated that the introduction of the Stinger may have actually prolonged their stay in Afghanistan rather than quickened their exit. Foreign Minister Edward Shevardnadze said in 1992, years after the Soviets had left, that the Stingers
made our military men, our hawks, much more determined than ever not to withdraw, not to appear to be giving in under duress.
One of Gorbachev's foreign policy advisors, Alexander Yakovlev, said the same thing, telling Selig Harrison that the Stingers definitely prolonged the Soviet stay in Afghanistan because
the military-industrial complex said they would develop a counter-weapon, and we should wait until it was tested.
Now you can believe these guys or not, but no evidence has emerged even after the fall of the Soviet Union to suggest that this played a huge role in Soviet decision-making. And no such evidence will ever emerge because, as Braithwaite writes, Gorbachev took the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan a full year before the first Stinger was fired. So these weapons were introduced on the grounds of killing more Soviets and getting them out of Afghanistan, something that I don't think we can confidently say they did. But what we do know for certain is that either the ISI or the Mujahideen commanders began selling their Stingers to American enemies almost immediately, with 16 being sold to Iran in 1987 and one nearly taking down a US helicopter in October of that year. When the war was all said and done, many of them appeared to end up in the hands of Al-Qaeda. So what the f, right? We have a movie where a bunch of good Americans who are actually pretty evil give a bunch of weapons and money to freedom fighters that are actually going to a drug trafficking sociopath to end a war that doesn't actually end because of these weapons at all. And that makes me mad. I am upset by Tom Hanks crawling into my computer to lie to me about the effectiveness of military weapons. But more importantly, I'm mad about the broader implications of this war, which touched pretty much everyone, even you. The best place to start when discussing these implications, though, is in Afghanistan, right after the Soviets left. One of the strangest decisions the movie makes is to present the war as though it was between the Russians and the Mujahideen exclusively. When the Soviets ultimately withdraw, this is presented as the end of the conflict. Gust tells Charlie that they now have to pivot their efforts to sending aid to Afghanistan to rebuild it. This conversation didn't happen, but that's not a big deal. I get it, you gotta cut some corners to make a movie. The problem with this scene is that it didn't happen because it doesn't really make sense for it to happen. The Soviets left Afghanistan in February of 1989, but the Afghan government maintained power for over 3 years after that, falling in April of 1992. The US was not going to start building schools and hospitals in a country that was still led by a Soviet-backed president, Najibullah. He went by one name, like Prince or Beyonce. The next scene shows Wilson begging to get humanitarian scraps for the Afghans, but he's ultimately denied. One of the other congressmen says that the president had recently said, "Afghanistan, is that still going on?" while discussing the situation with one of them. Again, this scene is a bit incoherent. I mean, to be clear, George H.W. Bush did say this quote exactly, but he didn't say it in response to congressional efforts to send humanitarian aid to the country. I mean, of course he did. Think about it. Is that still going on? What would he even mean by that? The country of Afghanistan? It doesn't make any sense. No, that's not what he meant. H.W. said this quote in 1991 when speaking to the CIA's Islamabad station chief, Milton Bearden. He was referring to the CIA's arms pipeline to the Mujahideen. Bush had naively believed that the CIA's efforts to funnel weapons to the country were created with the goal of getting the Soviets out. Now here he was, 2 years later, finding out that it was still happening. I would share in his confusion. Why was that still going on? So here, I want to fill in some gaps that the movie left us with. When the movie leaves us with a quote from Wilson saying they f***ed up the endgame in Afghanistan, does that truly just mean they failed to build schools and hospitals? No, that's not what it means. To understand why the US would want to continue funneling arms to Afghanistan even after the Soviets left, we first need to take a step back and find out when this process started. The movie presents it as though this operation didn't really get off the ground until Charlie found out about it while doing coke in Vegas. That's not the case. The US actually started funding the Mujahideen 6 months before the Soviet invasion, not after. Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, claims that he explained to Carter that, quote, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention, and that we didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. Once the Soviets invaded, Brzezinski pushed for policy that he believed would make the Soviets, quote, bleed for as much and as long as possible. I want to really emphasize the second part of that quote. They wanted to bleed the Soviets for as long as possible. That is not the language of someone who wants to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan for the sake of the noble freedom fighters. It's the language of a cold warrior who wants to hurt the Soviet Union, nothing more, nothing less. So although I can understand why one may think it is defensible for the US to support resistance groups fighting an indisputably oppressive regime in Afghanistan, it's important to note that this support was put in place with the hope of escalating the conflict and throwing more Afghans into the meat grinder to hurt the Soviet Union. The Politburo's decision to invade was made under the administration of Leonid Brezhnev in 1979. The Soviet troops were welcomed into the country by the brutal dictator Hafizullah Amin, who they assassinated quickly to install a more moderate guy named Babrak Karmal as president. Brezhnev would die in 1982 and be succeeded by Yuri Andropov, who was the head of the KGB and played a role in ultimately getting the country into Afghanistan. However, former UN Undersecretary General Diego Cordovez, who ultimately negotiated the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, wrote in his book that Andropov wanted the Russians out but was too sickly to make it happen and would die in February of 1984 before the negotiations achieved anything significant. He was followed by Konstantin Chernenko, who was just kind of a lame duck leader who died in March of 1985. Following him was Mikhail Gorbachev, who replaced Babrak Karmal with the former head of Afghan intelligence Najibullah as president. Najibullah was notorious for his use of torture in his old post, but was by far the most capable leader to hold the reins in the course of the Soviet occupation. So much so that a notable number of Afghans in Kabul grew to idolize him when the Americans came around a few years later. You can actually find some of his speeches on YouTube, and the comments are filled with people gushing about how awesome he was. I don't know, it's interesting. Gorbachev would then breathe life into the diplomatic process by making it clear that he wanted his country to withdraw troops. After a summit with Reagan in 1985, the Reagan administration began looking at a diplomatic solution to the conflict. Unfortunately, this was the Cold War, and nothing could ever be that simple. Throughout the entire war, there were two broad factions in America: the dealers, who sought to negotiate the Russians out to spare Afghan lives, and the bleeders, like Brzezinski, whose goal was first and foremost to kill Soviets in Afghanistan. Americans in Brzezinski's camp would insist that the replacement of the communist government in Afghanistan be a precondition to signing any sort of negotiated withdrawal with the Soviets. They ultimately failed to achieve this, but fought for a complete and total Soviet defeat until the very end. Part of the reason the US even agreed to sign off on the Geneva Accords was that they were under the impression that Najibullah would fall almost immediately. Now, to give you an idea of what happened when the Soviets left, I'll turn back to George Crile's epilogue in Charlie Wilson's War. Crile describes this period as, quote, the dark side of the Afghan adventure, which is interesting because 2 pages prior he said that 1 million Afghans were killed during the Soviet occupation. That wasn't the dark part, though. That was somehow the fun part, actually. Suddenly, things got a lot more complicated. Suddenly, this war that Charlie Wilson had repeatedly touted as the one morally unambiguous cause of the US since World War II became surprisingly murky. But the language that Crile uses here is probably worth a little eyebrow raise. He writes that,
by 1990, the Afghan freedom fighters had suddenly and frighteningly gone back to form, re-emerging as nothing more than feudal warlords obsessed with settling generations-old scores.
And I mean, like, come the fuck on. We're supposed to believe that these guys were bad, flipped the switch, and were on their best behavior throughout the war, only to flip back to being bad guys again when the Soviets left? I'm making a jerk-off motion with my hands right now. Get real, man. The reality was that Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was a heroin trafficking psycho throughout the entirety of the war. His bloodthirstiness was exactly why the CIA gave him so much money, and it's exactly why he brought about so much debate within US foreign policy circles. There was no return to form here. This was the form. Despite talks with Russian diplomats about the threat of radical Islamic extremism in general, and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar specifically, Charlie Wilson still managed to secure another $250 million for the Mujahideen in the second year after the Soviet withdrawal. These funds were matched by the Saudis for a total of $500 million. However, Najibullah had a few things working in his favor. While many at the CIA had predicted his immediate downfall, some shrewd foreign policy analysts pointed out that although Najibullah may have been widely perceived as a Soviet puppet with a lot of blood on his hands by his countrymen, he was still a lot less scary than Hekmatyar was, especially if you were a woman. One of these men offered you a government job and the ability to dress as you please, while the other wanted nothing more than to throw acid in your fucking face. The argument may not have carried much weight in the countryside, but it could actually get him pretty far in cities like Kabul. As far as strategy went, these analysts also pointed out that Najibullah could maintain power by pivoting from communism and towards Afghan nationalism, and using the funds he received from the Soviets to pay off mullahs and warlords to switch teams, both of which he did. So when the Mujahideen threw themselves at his strongholds expecting them to fall, they were instead slaughtered by his communist-turned-nationalist forces, which were still being flooded with around $3 billion in aid from the Soviets. So rather than quickly topple Najibullah and establish the freedom they had been promoted as fighting for, the Mujahideen were hijacking aid trucks in Pakistan, arousing the fears of their followers that Western NGO volunteers were teaching their women to wash with soap, and promoting free sex, leading them to burn their facilities down. At the same time, Hekmatyar began shelling the city of Khost, killing and displacing much of the civilian population. One diplomat would tell Crile,
the US government now finds itself giving guns to a friend who shells civilian populations, and then we turn around and send in humanitarian missions to deal with refugees created by our own investment.
It's a strange situation for a government to find itself in. I can't imagine a situation ever occurring anywhere except for in Palestine at the time that I'm writing this. Crile continues to describe how aid workers would follow the Mujahideen around, begging them to stop killing civilians. He remarks how odd it is that Russia and the US were both funding opposite sides of the war, despite having the same stated goal of combating Islamic extremism in the region. He explains this contradiction as a sense of inertia in which neither side wanted to be the first to pull back. And I cannot stress enough that this is a dog shit explanation of what was going on here. The simple fact is this. The reason that the US continued to support Islamic extremists in Afghanistan at this time was because of pure American Cold War anti-communism. It did not matter that Najibullah had made overtures to the Mujahideen, particularly Massoud, to secure a diplomatic solution. It didn't matter that he had conceded to pressure from the Soviets to offer to bring back King Zahir Shah in order to create a more broad-based political structure. It didn't matter that Najibullah had forsaken the PDPA's old communist tendencies when he was sworn in as leader, saying, "This is not a socialist revolutionary country, we do not want to build a communist society." None of that mattered because goddammit, the Cold War wasn't over yet and he still had the communist stink on him. So the US continued to send weapons and aid to some of the evilest motherfuckers on earth. It was so bad that even guys who wholeheartedly endorsed the program, like Ambassador Robert Oakley, started to wonder if maybe this new Mujahideen was no better than the Afghan government forces. They were disorganized and spent just as much time killing each other or innocent civilians as they spent killing the evil communists they were being paid to kill. But the US money would flow in one final time in 1991, with Charlie Wilson managing to round up another $200 million, which was matched by the Saudis despite the Soviets being long gone. The result was that Najibullah finally fell in April of 1992. This is incredibly significant, so if you've been listening passively so far, I want you to lock in for a second, hear me out, and then remember what I'm about to tell you throughout the rest of the video so you can understand why this is the worst covert operation of all time. The Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991, meaning that the Afghan government outlasted them by 4 months. This means that the Afghan government could sustain itself for 3 years without Soviet troops on the ground, but not 6 months without their financial and logistical support to the tune of several $billions a year. When that money dried up, so did they. And given that the Soviet Union was barreling towards dissolution for reasons completely unrelated to the war in Afghanistan, those funds were going to dry up around 1992 no matter what. So what you should glean from this is that the Soviet-backed government of Afghanistan probably didn't even expire because of the CIA's massive covert operation at all. It expired because its sugar daddy died. As every socialist regime collapsed around it, it seemed profoundly unlikely that Najibullah would have been able to maintain control. If he did, it would have been through transforming the Afghan economy into something suitable for foreign investment. So what was really accomplished here then? The Afghan government lived about as long as it possibly could have. And without massive CIA funds running through the country, who knows? Maybe Hekmatyar and the fundamentalist Mujahideen leaders would have been complete nobodies, and something more positive could have bubbled up in its place. The idea of some kind of secular democratic resistance in Afghanistan can be hard to grasp given the way the country is often portrayed. But prior to the Soviet invasion, radical Islamic elements in Afghanistan were extremely small and largely insignificant. And although much of the rapid radicalization of the Afghans can be chalked up to the Soviet invasion itself, a sizable chunk of the blame falls on the United States as well, as they sent between 67 and 73% of the weapons to the 4 more fundamentalist parties of the Mujahideen, with the bulk of this going to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. But in 1980, early on in the war, the Afghan people attempted to organize an alternative and brought together a Loya Jirga, a national assembly which sought to represent a wide range of Afghan groups. The program they wanted to implement was far more moderate than that of any of the major Mujahideen groups, which the assembly found to be repellent. The US made no effort to intervene when the ISI threatened to cut off the supply of US weapons to these groups, effectively forcing them to join one of the favored Mujahideen factions if they wanted to effectively resist the Soviets. Despite this, the people of Afghanistan never really stopped hoping for a more moderate form of governance. In 1987, a poll from the Afghan Information Center in Pakistan found that among over 2,000 randomly sampled Afghans in 108 refugee camps, 71.6% were in favor of King Zahir Shah returning to lead a post-war Afghanistan. However, both the ISI and the fundamentalist Mujahideen leaders vehemently opposed both the king for his more moderate nature and the concept of a national assembly because they derived their power from Islamic preaching and foreign aid, not from democracy. As I mentioned earlier in the video, not long after this research came out, the director of the Afghan Information Center was assassinated by men believed to be members of HEKMATYAR'S organization. When Najibullah finally fled the presidential palace to seek sanctuary from the UN, the end of his government brought about a new civil war. Hekmatyar would go on to shell Kabul mercilessly. The capital had managed to get through the prior war relatively unscathed, but when Hekmatyar was done with it, 40% of its housing was destroyed, 50,000 people, almost all of whom were civilians, were killed, and the population of the city had dropped from 2 million to 500,000, earning him the nickname the Butcher of Kabul. At the same time, the forces of Massoud who fought against Hekmatyar were not that much better, with their propensity to kill civilians basically decimating his chances of ever running the country either. This bloody conflict allowed the Taliban to sweep themselves into power on a platform as simple as "we're not those assholes." I cannot stress enough that when placed in a popularity contest, Americans' top lads in Afghanistan were routed by the Taliban. The new radical government in Afghanistan would then close the book on Charlie Wilson's war by capturing Najibullah from a UN compound, killing him and his brother, dragging their bodies behind trucks, castrating them, and hanging their corpses from a traffic pole outside the presidential palace in Kabul. And you probably have a rough idea of where the story goes from there. The Taliban ruled with an iron fist for a number of years and provided safe haven to Al-Qaeda, who would go on to carry out 9/11. It might be worth noting here that while the Taliban was sheltering Al-Qaeda, Massoud and his Northern Alliance were sending a meager handful of lobbyists to Washington to attempt to scrounge together more money to unseat the Taliban and to remove Al-Qaeda. However, they weren't able to get much attention from members of Congress because they had to compete against Pakistan's well-connected lobbyists, the most notorious of which was the former Congressman Charlie Wilson. None of this would ever wear on Wilson, though. As George Crile writes in his book, Charlie took solace in knowing that the attacks had been carried out by Arabs rather than Afghans, before finding out shortly after that, quote, "this thing was all based in my mountains." Charlie and everyone else involved would insist that they felt no culpability here. Crile speculates that Wilson probably rationalizes this as a situation where their intentions were just that good. Joanne Herring would defend the jihad by saying that she cannot predict the future, which could be fair enough. But I want to take a little dive into why so many people suggest that the architects of the CIA's jihad hold some responsibility here.
9/11.
If I wanted to cover the whole story on how 9/11 happened, I would start this thing about 100 years ago in Egypt, work my way through Saudi Arabia, loop into Afghanistan and out to Sudan before we finally reach New York. And maybe someday I'll give that story the breadth it deserves. But right now, I'm telling you the story of the US and Afghanistan specifically, so if you think I'm missing some important details, eat pant, that's a story for another time. The story of US involvement in the road to 9/11 arguably began when the CIA's man in the Middle East, the Shah of Iran, convinced the conservative president of Afghanistan, Mohammed Daoud Khan, to suppress the Afghan Communist Party in an attempt to consolidate power and become cozier with the Americans in the early 70s. When he dismissed the communists from government and prominent military positions and announced that he would be banning all other political parties, the Afghan communists felt their hand had been forced and began working on plans for a coup, which would ultimately result in the Soviet invasion in 1979. And while the Soviet invasion played a huge role in radicalizing a significant chunk of Afghanistan and the surrounding region, the CIA played a very active role in facilitating foreign participation in the jihad. Outsiders who were recruited into the Holy War were called Arab Afghans, despite the fact they were not Afghans and sometimes not even Arab. The term basically just applied to all non-natives fighting in the war. Peter Dale Scott describes this project not as one created by the Afghans, but rather one that was imposed upon them by the CIA, Saudi intelligence, and the ISI. The idea was first proposed by the head of French intelligence, Alexandre de Morange, who you may remember as the guy who recruited Joanne Herring to the cause of the Afghans. He'll come up again in the next chapter when he suggests that the US introduced drugs into the conflict. Just a real superstar of an intelligence agent. And while there appears to be very little evidence that the CIA actually provided funds directly to a guy like Osama bin Laden specifically, they did appear to help lay the groundwork for what would later become Al-Qaeda. During the war, CIA Director Bill Casey backed the ISI's plan to recruit jihadis from abroad, and while many of them were trained in Pakistan, their leaders were trained by the CIA in Virginia. Now, the problem with the conversation around this war and how it relates to Al-Qaeda is that most people don't know what they're talking about and refuse to name names. But this video is going to be long as hell, so I've got time. Let's get specific. The Arab Afghan program was run by Jalaluddin Haqqani, a man who was a good friend of Osama bin Laden, but also pretty tight with our boy Charlie Wilson. Much like Hekmatyar, Haqqani is another pivotal figure in the war who the movie made sure not to mention. The book, however, was a bit more open about his involvement. George Crile says that Wilson described Haqqani as, quote, goodness personified, and that he received, quote, bags of money from the CIA for his part in recruiting Arab Afghans to the cause. Haqqani's network would provide protection to Osama bin Laden's early al-Qaeda training centers, and when al-Qaeda was fleeing from US forces in 2001, he provided safe haven to Osama's second-in-command, Ayman al-Zawahiri's wife and children. He even allegedly facilitated the escape of Osama bin Laden himself. A few years down the line, when the US was struggling to root out Afghan insurgents in the mid-2000s, it was not just the Taliban they were fighting, but also Haqqani and his al-Qaeda collaborators in the East. This would all culminate with Haqqani becoming America's number 3 target in Afghanistan, behind just Osama bin Laden himself and Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban and yet another hero of the Mujahideen. So according to this book, we have Haqqani working on behalf of the CIA to create a network of radical extremists all over the world, and we have him helping Osama and his allies to escape the consequences of their actions. But we still have a lot of gaps to fill here. Who was it that actually turned this network into a global terrorist organization? To get that side of the story, we have to turn to Egyptian cleric Omar Abdel Rahman, known as the Blind Sheikh. Prior to the war in Afghanistan, the Blind Sheikh became close with a radical terror group in Egypt known as the Islamic Group, which he would go on to lead. The Islamic Group worked closely with their affiliate Islamic Jihad, which was led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, the future al-Qaeda leader I mentioned a few moments ago. The Blind Sheikh would spend 6 months in prison after his men killed Egyptian President Anwar el-Sadat. The Sheikh specifically was arrested because he had recently declared that a, quote, heretical leader deserved to be killed by the faithful. His lawyers would ultimately be able to get him off because he had not named Sadat directly in his fatwa, even though there was a direct line from there to Sadat's death. Which, I mean, fair enough as far as legal proceedings go, but the result is that the Sheikh was now the leader of one of the most radical terror groups in all of Egypt, and he was now free to enter the fray in Afghanistan. What the CIA was looking for at this point was a skilled rhetorician who could stir up the masses to put their lives on the line against the godless communists. Before the Blind Sheikh, their golden goose was Sheikh Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian radical who is best known for mentoring Osama bin Laden. Robert Friedman would write for The New Yorker,
chief amongst the CIA's allies of the moment was Sheikh Abdullah Azzam. Barnett R. Rubin, a Columbia University associate professor and senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, says sources have told him that Sheikh Azzam was enlisted by the CIA to unite fractious rebel groups operating in Peshawar. Rubin reports that Azzam was considered a prime asset because of his close connections with the Muslim Brotherhood, Saudi intelligence, and the Muslim World League. Azzam also headed the Islamic Coordination Council in Peshawar, which generally supervised the military activities of the Arab Mujahideen.
Azzam would repeatedly make trips to the United States, especially to New York, to preach about the necessity of jihad and his goals of ultimately tearing down the West and all earthly regimes. Despite essentially calling for the death of the West, he had no issues gaining entry to the US until he was killed in a car bombing in 1989. Although the Soviets had left Afghanistan by this point, the US still had a war to fund against the Afghan government, so they continued to facilitate the Blind Sheikh's entry into America, something they had been doing since 1986. According to Rubin, the Sheikh was paid by the CIA to go to Pakistan and send a message of unity to the fractured Mujahideen to encourage them to coalesce once more to finally destroy President Najibullah. The problem was that he was giving similar lectures in America. This flew under the radar until 1993, when Ramzi Youssef carried out the World Trade Center bombing and Islamic radicalism came to the front of mind for Americans for the first time. It was quickly discovered that the US provided the Blind Sheikh with 4 US visas beginning in 1986, despite the fact that he was on the State Department's terrorist watch list for his connection to Sadat's murder. To make matters worse, each of these visas had been approved by CIA agents acting as consular officers. Now, the CIA insists that every single one of these visas were provided in error, and that these officers just didn't do their due diligence. But I want to think about this for a second. What are the odds that this guy's file just keeps coming across the desks of CIA agents? And what are the odds that every single one of them just neglects to realize that this guy is on a State Department watch list before approving his entry? Combine that with the fact that we have a reputable academic who runs in foreign policy circles saying that he has heard directly from his peers that the Sheikh was a CIA asset, along with the president of Egypt and other retired intelligence officers saying the same thing? I'm sorry, it's hogwash. This guy was absolutely brought in by the CIA to recruit more Arab Afghans for the jihad, and that's exactly what he did. And if you're wondering why the Sheikh would just never admit that he was a CIA asset, you need to understand that this would blow up his whole thing. He could not make an entire career out of railing against the West, only to admit that he had been working as their puppet a few years prior. Rubin alleges that this exact sentiment was expressed by former US Ambassador to Pakistan, Robert Oakley, who said that such an admission would destroy his credibility with his radical followers. By 1991, the Blind Sheikh, along with Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, had turned the Al-Kifah Center in Brooklyn, which had been hugely important in CIA efforts to drum up support for the Mujahideen, into a hub for Al-Qaeda. For the next few years, Osama bin Laden would cover his living expenses while he spread the word of Al-Qaeda. The Sheikh would ultimately be arrested in 1993 and convicted in 1995 for planning various assassinations and bombings intended for UN headquarters, as well as prominent bridges and tunnels in New York City and New Jersey. Although he was not charged for Ramzi Yousef's World Trade Center bombing directly, he and his allies were convicted of conspiring with the bombers. But his incarceration would not put an end to the terror being carried out in his name. Over the years, Al-Qaeda would repeatedly plan attacks and successfully carry some of them out in the hopes of bringing about the release of the Sheikh, as he was seen as their spiritual leader. But before I can close the book on 9/11, I need to cover one last noble freedom fighter. The last piece of the puzzle here is the muscle. These Arab Afghans being recruited by the Sheikh needed training, and who better to give it to them than a Green Beret? Much like the Sheikh, Ali Mohammed got his start as a radical in Egypt. However, rather than fighting against the Egyptian government, he had been a part of it. He worked his way up the ranks of Egyptian military intelligence for 13 years and became a major before being discharged in 1984. The decision was made after the prior president had been assassinated by Islamic extremists, and his successor, Hosni Mubarak, purged the more radical elements from his military. It was probably the right call, considering Mohammed had joined Ayman al-Zawahiri's Islamic Jihad in 1981. Now that he was free from his military duties, Mohammed was tasked with infiltrating a US intelligence service. So in 1984, he waltzed into a CIA station in Cairo looking for a job, which he was given without needing to take a polygraph. The agency then tasked him with infiltrating a Hamburg mosque with ties to Al-Qaeda. Mohammed proceeded to immediately blow his cover by telling members of the mosque that he was a Fed. The CIA, immediately thereafter, shit-canned him and told other US agencies not to hire him and even detain him if they could. This should have immediately ended Mohammed's career as a double agent. I mean, come on, this is rookie shit. But it was only the beginning. Despite being on the State Department watch list, Mohammed was able to secure a US entry visa in 1985. A Boston Globe article 10 years later would quote an anonymous government source as saying that Mohammed had secured this visa with the help of the CIA. US officials would deny that the CIA had any role in the process, but didn't rule out other agencies playing a role here. But for what it's worth, when he actually got to America, one of his acquaintances would claim that, quote, everyone in the community knew that he was working as a liaison between the CIA and the Afghan cause. So who the f*** knows? But what matters is that despite showing himself to be more loyal to the guys the US wanted to surveil, he was now in America and he quickly began recruiting people to join Al-Qaeda, making frequent trips to Africa and Afghanistan before entering the US military in 1986. He would quickly rise up the ranks and get himself stationed at Fort Bragg, where he was assigned to the JFK Special Warfare Center. If this strikes you as odd, it probably should. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Anderson, would go on to say,
"You and I would have a better chance of winning the Powerball lottery than Ali Mohammed getting assigned to a Special Forces unit at Fort Bragg. If you propose this to any non-commissioned officer or commissioned officer, they'd tell you it didn't happen without support from an outside agency. I would say that it would have to be the CIA getting him into the United States. And then once in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Investigations."
While some have pointed out that Mohammed did not have a security clearance at Fort Bragg, he was still able to obtain top-secret training manuals and information on US troop strength, which he smuggled to Al-Qaeda. In 1988, he would defy the orders of his superiors to go on vacation in Afghanistan to fight alongside the Mujahideen. By 1989, after the Soviets had withdrawn from Afghanistan, Mohammed, who was an active member of the Green Berets, began taking weekend trips to New York to train members of Al-Qaeda from Egypt and Afghanistan. Between his ability to infiltrate US intelligence and train foot soldiers, Mohammed had seriously endeared himself to Osama bin Laden himself by the early 90s. Because of this, he was tasked with helping bin Laden move his base of operations to Sudan. This was not just about moving Osama himself. It's important to recognize that by the end of the war, Osama was the leader of the Arab Afghans. So when he moved his base of operations to Sudan and then back to Afghanistan, he tasked Mohammed with helping him transport 2,000 Arab Afghans with him. Mohammed would remain a free man for years to come while working for the FBI and using this connection to avoid being detained or investigated for the unbelievable amount of ties he had to terrorists all over the world. He wouldn't go down until 1998 when he was arrested for helping al-Qaeda bomb US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. He would plead guilty to these crimes in 2000, and to this day, he has still not been sentenced. Weird. So before I move along to the next section here, I want to summarize this and really drive this point home. The United States gave a fuck ton of money to radical extremists in Afghanistan, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, to create guerrilla armies. But they also gave money to guys like Jalaluddin Haqqani to help bring in foreign extremists to fight in the war too. They enlisted clerics like the Blind Sheikh and Azam to spread the good word, and when they were killed or arrested, they acted as a lightning rod for subsequent attacks all over the world. The men that the Sheikh recruited and Haqqani organized would coalesce around Osama bin Laden when the war came to an end, making him their undisputed leader. And when these Arab Afghans needed some polish, a member of the US military helped to train them and plan future operations before he was caught. He was able to hide in plain sight for years because, according to terrorism expert Steve Emerson,
once someone is considered an asset, it insulates them from being investigated as a suspect or a defendant.
Richard Murphy, a Reagan administration official covering Near East affairs, would concede later that the US had spawned, quote, a monster in Afghanistan. Which was true, but I really want to drive home how bad this was. When guys like Azam issued the call for Muslims abroad to come and fight the Soviets, it was not the cream of the crop who made their way to Afghanistan. It was largely the radicals whose home country wanted nothing to do with them. Because of this, when many of the Arab Afghans were ready to return home, their countries of origin refused to have them back. These were the kinds of people that the CIA were bringing in the hopes of tipping the scales, and I cannot stress enough that it didn't even fucking work. There were never more than 3,000 Arab Afghans on the ground in Afghanistan at any given time, and they did not meaningfully change the course of the war. But the US was left with what would be called a disposal problem. As former investigative counsel for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Jack Bloom, would put it,
when you motivate people to fight for a cause, jihad, the problem is, how do you shut them off?
Unfortunately, we still don't know the answer to this question because the US never figured it out. Instead, we learned that if you don't have a solution to the disposal problem, you end up with Osama bin Laden changing focus to America. A move that was supported by Haqqani and a few thousand of the fighters he and Osama had worked together to organize. Their goals are then realized by guys like the Blind Sheikh and his followers who bombed the World Trade Center and US embassies all over the world. It leads to 9/11, which spawned two massive war efforts from the US and changed the course of national security everywhere, forever. But you already knew about that stuff. Everybody knows about that stuff. What you may not know is that the human toll suffered by the US between 9/11, Iraq, and Afghanistan is absolutely nothing compared to the amount of destruction the US helped to unleash on the world after the war was over. To close this out, I'm going to tell you about heroin. Throughout the course of this video, I've talked about how the US helped to destabilize Afghanistan at home and how they set the stage for the global jihad after the war ended. I think that the average person has a vague understanding of these things, even if they may be missing a few pieces of the puzzle. However, I think precious few people comprehend the degrees to which heroin produced in Afghanistan has ruined people's lives. So I want to take us back to the beginning. Early on in the war, former French intelligence head Alexandre de Moranche, a real-life Littlefinger if I ever saw one, told Ronald Reagan to use drugs confiscated by the DEA, FBI, and other agencies to supply to Russian soldiers. When word was passed along to Bill Casey, the head of the CIA, he was so excited he started jumping out of his chair and shit. De Moranche claimed that the French would ultimately drop out of the operation when Casey told him that he couldn't guarantee de Moranche's part in the plot would not leak out to the press. And it seems to be the case that Operation Mosquito, as designed by de Moranche, was never put into action. But, given that Reagan and Casey both loved the idea, a quick look at how the drug trade shook out in Afghanistan appears to indicate some degree of complicity on the part of US intelligence. Former head of international narcotics control in the Carter administration, Matteo Falco, told Vanity Fair in 2002 that in regards to drug trafficking,
we always let it happen through them. And we're continuing to let it happen with the Northern Alliance right now.
Sadat Alimova, a Tajik sociologist, also indicated that Russian soldiers were often invited to try the drugs being supplied by the Afghans and that, quote, secret agents would use drug dealers, quote, in their own interests. Beyond these personal testimonies, we can turn to Alfred McCoy's book, The Politics of Heroin, to get a pretty good idea of what was going on here and why. When Jimmy Carter began sending aid to the Mujahideen in 1979, Dr. David Musto, a Yale psychiatrist working on Carter's Council on Drug Abuse, raised concerns to the council that providing funds to opium growers would repeat the same mistakes the US had made in Laos just a few years prior. He recommended paying the opium producers to destroy their crops, but his requests fell on deaf ears. Musto would write in an op-ed for the New York Times that by 1979, while Afghanistan and Pakistan began ramping up heroin production, the number of drug-related deaths in New York would increase by 77%. He warned that the product coming from Afghanistan was, quote, more potent, cheaper, and more available than at any time in the last 20 years. Part of this was out of the hands of the administration as the situation in Afghanistan made it difficult for the DEA to get close to the sources of the opium. What was within their control is what McCoy describes as, quote, CIA protection for drug lord allies in its covert wars. He writes that the CIA aid to the Mujahideen had expanded opium production in Afghanistan and brought the heroin labs in Pakistan to the world stage. To be clear, there was always a heroin racket in these countries, but the scale of the operation would completely explode over the coming years. Prior to the Soviet invasion, both Afghanistan and Pakistan sold whatever heroin they produced to Iran and India. Once the CIA showed up, however, the traffickers were given, quote, the political protection and logistic linkages that brought their supply to Europe and America. This allowed Afghanistan to become, quote, the world's second largest opium grower by the early 1980s. Although the US would put pressure on Pakistan to limit its heroin production, they simply shifted production to Afghanistan and refined the opium sent to them. The US did nothing to stop this because they had a small handful of high-ranking Mujahideen running operations. Removing even one of them from the field could have seriously undermined the jihad. This choice allowed my least favorite Afghan, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, to use his CIA-funded militia to become, quote, one of Afghanistan's leading drug lords. Now, of course, the US media didn't publish a negative word about Hekmatyar and his allies until the Soviets had withdrawn, but they got there eventually. In May of 1990, the Washington Post reported that the US had ignored complaints of heroin trafficking by Hekmatyar and the ISI. Hekmatyar controlled 6 heroin refineries in Afghanistan and faced no repercussions as he and other drug trafficking elements in the ISI were ultimately protected by Pakistani General Fazl Haq, a man who Interpol had identified as a drug trafficker as early as 1982, though investigations of his heroin syndicates were, quote, aborted at the highest level. In addition to their interest in protecting the sanctity of the jihad, Pakistan could not risk blowing up the heroin traffic because of how important it was to their economy. Pakistani traffickers would deposit their money in the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, which ultimately moved $4 billion in Pakistani heroin money by 1989, more than the country's legal exports. And the impact of this was absolutely massive. In Pakistan itself, the country went from having no heroin addicts in 1979 to 5,000 in 1980, 70,000 in 1983, and over 1.3 million addicts in 1985. When questions were raised about providing hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to Pakistan while they supplied over half of the heroin flowing through America, Washington beefed up DEA presence in Islamabad. Despite having 17 agents, 16 staff, and a nearly $20 million budget between 1985 and 1988, the DEA was somehow unable to stage any noteworthy investigations or arrest anyone at all. The US Government Accounting Office would report that, quote, not a single Pakistani trafficker is known to have been imprisoned prior to 1984, and that the traffickers jailed after that, quote, were quietly released after serving a few months. Because the CIA did not want any disclosures of their links to the heroin traffickers, some DEA agents asked to be transferred elsewhere, and at least one of them resigned. But you may be thinking, I don't know, I'm not an expert in drug running. Maybe it's simply the case that this is all a bunch of malarkey. Maybe it's just a coincidence that the CIA and the DEA didn't arrest a single soul despite having a significant presence in the region where the global heroin traffic was exploding. Maybe the mainstream press in the US just couldn't find any evidence until after the Soviets left. I actually love the CIA and I want to hug and kiss them. And if you're thinking that, grow up. Really, come on, man. They knew what was going on. DEA Congressional Liaison David Milochik would tell a congressional committee about the drug trade in Afghanistan, saying,
"You can say the rebels make their money off the sale of opium. There's no doubt about it. These rebels keep their cause going through the sale of opium."
Periodically, the heroin traffic would be revealed through more minor incidents. In December of 1983, a minor Pakistani trafficker was caught at an Oslo airport with heroin, and the cops there were able to investigate and force Pakistan's Federal Investigation Agency to arrest the VP of the government's Habib Bank, despite the protests of President Zia's wife. In May of 1983, an arrest in Japan led to the exposure of Mirza Iqbal Baig as one of the most prolific drug traffickers in Pakistan. Despite a mountain of evidence against him, the DEA could not prosecute him in Pakistan for fear of political harm that could befall President Zia. Instead, they tried to get Baig to a foreign jurisdiction where the political ramifications would be less severe, but when they failed, they just gave up. One of the DEA agents working in the region would later tell the Washington Post that one of the 5 CIA officers working in their office told them to scale back their investigations for the duration of the war. Now, whether that's true or not, it's undeniable that the heroin trade exploded in Afghanistan at this time, and the intelligence agencies operating in the region needed to answer for that. And they did. Sorta. Charles Cogan, who directed much of the CIA's operation in Afghanistan during the war, was completely unapologetic about the CIA's negligence, saying,
"Our mission was to do as much damage as possible to the Soviets. We didn't really have the resources or the time to devote an investigation to the drug trade. I don't think that we need to apologize for this. Every situation has its fallout. There was a fallout in terms of drugs, yes, but the main objective was accomplished. The Soviets left Afghanistan."
From their perspective, it made all the sense in the world to just let things play out this way. Arresting allies like HEKMATYAR would take effective anti-Soviet fighters out of the field, not to mention embarrass the agency to show that their allies in the Cold War were actually their enemies in the drug war. It was also just convenient to see that kind of entrepreneurship on display. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar used his heroin money to create a hierarchical party structure and military apparatus for whenever the US money dried up. It's called passive income, sweaty. Look it up. But despite the attempts by people like Cogan to sweep this practice under the rug, we need to look at exactly what was entailed in this fallout in terms of drugs that he refers to. Let me hit you with some quick statistics to give you an idea of what this fallout looked like in the years immediately following the war. By the end of the 1980s, Zia's successor was forced to fight a drug war in a country where the heroin trade brought in $8 to $10 billion annually, more than the entire government budget and equivalent to about 25% of the country's GDP. By 1992, CIA reports said that the drug trade in Pakistan was, quote, virtually the same size as the legitimate economy. In 2001, the UN Annual Review of AIDS indicated that Eastern Europe and Central Asia saw 250,000 new HIV infections, raising the total to over 1 million, with much of the increase due to injected drugs. With an economy that had completely fallen apart when US aid dried up, opium was believed to have made up over half of Afghanistan's employment in 1999. One can understand why when you realize they were supplying 90% of Europe's heroin. Over a 20-year period, 2,700 Iranian border guards were killed in border clashes with drug smugglers. Despite their efforts to keep the smugglers out, their addict population increased from 1.2 million to 3.3 million in 2001. By 1997, the UN believed that 1/3 of Tajikistan's GDP was generated from drug trafficking. The situation would not improve once US troops got to Afghanistan. The UN would report in 2009 that
the number of heroin addicts in Russia has gone up by a factor of 10 in the past decade, to the point that more Russians die every year from Afghan drugs, more than 30,000 according to government figures, than the total number of Red Army soldiers killed during the 10-year Afghan war. In NATO countries, the number of people who die of heroin overdoses every year, more than 10,000, is 5 times higher than the total number of NATO troops killed in Afghanistan in the past 8 years.
Around this time, opium made up 53% of Afghan GDP and provided 93% of the world's heroin supply. And I really want to drive home, these are not just statistics. These are millions of people's lives destroyed by the fact that the intelligence agencies tasked with stopping thousands of tons of heroin from entering the global market decided they had other things to worry about. By giving money and weapons to someone like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, the CIA protected him from any kind of investigation for drug trafficking. If you're not familiar with this topic and think that the CIA covering up for drug traffickers to cover their own asses is far-fetched or in any way conspiratorial, I can assure you, this has not only happened before, but it's not even really a secret, as the CIA has publicly helped drug smugglers avoid their indictments. One example occurred in 1975 when Thai businessman Puttaporn Kramkaran was arrested for smuggling somewhere between 50 and 104 pounds of opium into America. The the charges would ultimately be dropped because the Thai national was working as a spy for the CIA. Former CIA Director Bill Colby would tell a congressional committee,
"It was quite easy to see that his activity for us would be revealed in the course of the trial. We requested the Justice Department not try him for this reason. They agreed."
And this is what people are talking about when they say that the CIA traffics drugs. It's not an active process where American intelligence officers do the dirty work. It's a passive one. They don't need to help these guys grow or refine opium. They just needed to sit back and let it happen. 17 DEA agents and millions of dollars led to precisely 0 arrests throughout the entirety of the Soviet-Afghan war, while the world was flooded with cheap, pure heroin. And the people responsible faced absolutely 0 consequences for it, because as far as they were concerned, the Soviets left, so they were successful. And maybe I'm just being a pessimist, but I think that sucks. I think it's all bullshit, and it sucks that Tom Hanks produced a movie that portrayed any part of this as a victory for anyone that you should care about. This was never about saving Afghans. Charlie would say so himself when he told journalist Selig Harrison,
"I hated the Russians and the communists. There were 167 funerals in my district during the Vietnam War, and I felt we should get even." 167. 167! Jesus Christ.
But at least, when the Soviets threw their weight behind the North Vietnamese in that war, they were supporting a well-organized military with common goals and an agreed-upon political program. They weren't perfect by any means, but they were a united force. In the Afghan war, the US just threw gas on the fire and created a situation that could only possibly end in a civil war. When the Soviets finally left, the only people who could possibly call it a victory were the guys that Charlie Wilson popped bottles with in Langley, the people who gave him a medal for helping them destroy a country. The people that mattered were left to tend to their opium and hope to not get caught in the crossfire of the nearly endless wars they would endure for the next 30 years. And had this situation been handled intelligently, none of that would have ever needed to happen. Okay, so at this point, I have to assume we're all on the same page here. The true story of this conflict is not one where the US carried out a competent covert operation only to fail to stick the landing like this movie suggests. The reality is that the US believed that the enemy of their enemy was their friend, and they could not have possibly been more wrong. They gave money to all of the wrong people, and it caused wars and produced drugs that killed hundreds of thousands of people, all in the hopes of overthrowing a government that survived anyway and seems to have fallen for reasons largely independent of this covert operation. I covered all of this, and the result is a video that's probably longer than the movie I'm criticizing. So now there's only one last thing to say: why I did all this, and why I singled out Tom Hanks in the title. Last year, I read Peter Dale Scott's book, The Road to 9/11, which taught me quite a bit about the things I've been covering here. In it, Scott mentions that the 3 best books to read for information on US involvement in the Soviet-Afghan War were Ghost Wars by Steve Cole, Out of Afghanistan by Diego Cordovez and Selig Harrison, and Charlie Wilson's War by George Crile. And he may well be right. These books are excellent and contain a ton of information that I've cited throughout the video. But it seemed so odd to me that one of these works, which to some extent was an indictment of US foreign policy blunders, could have been adapted into a major motion picture. And that is where our good friend Tom Hanks enters the fray. I mean, this movie was never going to touch HEKMATYAR or Heroin or any of that stuff because the book largely steers clear of it too. But 9/11 was very much on the table. Crile dealt with it in the epilogue of his book, and this was allegedly going to be how the movie ended as well. But Tom Hanks, who co-produced the movie, is said to have vetoed this ending. Melissa Roddy, an LA filmmaker with ties to production, said that Hanks had this scene cut because he, quote, just couldn't deal with this 9/11 thing. Instead, this scene was merely alluded to with a plane flying overhead as Gust and Charlie discussed their next steps in Afghanistan.
Listen to what I'm telling you.
But I'm sorry, it doesn't work. The average viewer does not get this reference. The popular understanding of 9/11 does not include Charlie Wilson, the CIA, or any of what we're shown in this movie. And to the extent that one may be able to make this connection, the movie tells us that the real error here was that the US didn't build enough libraries after the war ended. And that is why I'm mad. That is why I'm here. Because Charlie Wilson waged a war that he felt was America's first unambiguous conflict since World War II. But it became clear to George Crile decades ago that this war was not quite so unambiguous when he saw the character of the men the US had been funding, and he didn't know a fraction of the things I told you about the heroin trade. But Tom Hanks and whoever else held creative control of this movie knowingly swept all of that under the rug. They decided they couldn't cope with this 9/11 thing and instead revived Charlie's perception of his unambiguous holy war. And given that there are really no other significant movies on the Soviet-Afghan war besides fucking Rambo, they won. This story of the US helping to destroy a country and the lives of millions across the world is instead rebranded as a victory over the international communist conspiracy. Afghanistan did not become engulfed in civil war because the US funded the wrong people, it's actually because they stopped funding them. The war is no longer about destroying a communist government, it's about Afghan national sovereignty. In this version of events, we learn all the wrong lessons, which means that the people who view it are doomed to repeat them in the future. And yes, that is at least in part the fault of Tom Hanks, and it either makes him an idiot or a bit of a freak. So for the love of God, if you find yourself watching a movie like this and something feels fishy or feels a bit too good to be true, please read a book. If you don't know where to start, I'll show some on screen here with a quick review for each of them. While you read through that, I'd like to shill our Patreon as well. We're going to be posting early access videos there as well as regular monthly content. Sometimes it'll be previews of upcoming videos, sometimes it'll be early access to future ones, it kind of depends how we feel. Soon we'll be posting about 40 minutes worth of content that was cut from this video covering the warped Cold War logic the Soviets used to justify going into Afghanistan and killing 1 million people. So yeah, pay us money to access that, and then I can devote more time to working on these and finishing these videos faster for you guys. Anyway, thank you all for your support. We love you deeply, even the haters and losers. We'll have another video for you coming soon. See ya, nerds.